The host of Gun Talk, Mr. Tom Gresham, is with us. Tom, how are you, sir?
I'm well, Cam. How goes the wars?
You know, we're just doing our part each and every day, and I got to tell you, I'm kind of cautiously optimistic. I was just talking about this a couple of minutes ago. You know, we've seen these polls this week showing 26% of Americans can name all three branches of government, 33% can't name a single one, less than a half of Californians support free speech, and yet this Wall Street Journal NBC poll shows that 48% of Americans live in a home with a firearm. 50% of Americans say that they are more concerned that the government is going to try to take away their rights. 45% say that they're afraid the government's not going to go far enough with gun control. We seem to be losing a lot of respect and a lot of knowledge for a lot of our rights, but the Second Amendment, I got to say, remains in support for the Second Amendment, remains really strong, comparatively speaking.
Well, when you go back, 25 years ago, when concealed carry was fairly new, coming out of Florida primarily, and it just kept growing, and state by state adopted it, where basically almost anywhere you can get, at least theoretically, you can get a permit. We knew what was going to happen, and then you add into that, Kim, the last 5 to 10 years, where we have millions, literally millions of women getting into shooting, particularly through self-defense. What has happened is you have an expansion across the breadth of the country in terms of how many people are into guns, have guns, shoot guns, or just think that guns and gun rights are important. And you take 9/11, Katrina, and the other disasters out there, and the constant news harping on crime and these terrible disasters. I think you just have a much greater percentage of the population who understands that they are the only ones responsible for their own safety.
I suspect that you are correct about that, Tom. And again, I mean, you go back, as you say, you can't just look at this issue, a year ago, 5 years ago. We really have seen over the past 30 years, starting with Florida back in the late 80s, 87, I think it was, 30 years ago, this right-to-carry revolution. Where now you've got the vast majority of states in the country are shall issue. You've got more states that are constitutional carry than the quote-unquote may issue states. And no state has gone backwards, Tom. No state has said, well, we tried this as an experiment, didn't work out for us. We're going to go back to making these concealed carry licenses really, really restrictive. This has gone in one direction.
I had not thought of that. It was obvious, but I've never thought, nobody went back. Well, you know why? Because once the people get the ability, they always had the right, but once they get the ability to take care of themselves, they're not about to give that up to the phony, and everybody understands it's a phony idea that the state, the feds, or anybody else will protect you.
Well, yes. And, I think a perfect example of this right now is playing out in Baltimore, Maryland, where, they're on pace for a record number of homicides. 4 years ago, the state of Maryland passed the Maryland Firearm Safety Act, which was supposed to make Maryland safer, right? It was the Firearm Safety Act, and clearly that hasn't been the case in Baltimore. So they had this bill before the city council that was going to mandate a year behind bars for anybody caught in illegal possession of a gun. There were protests saying that, listen, this is going to be used to throw people behind bars who aren't violent criminals, who are just carrying a gun. They changed that law, so now you're guaranteed not to go to jail the first time you're caught carrying a gun without a concealed carry license. Clearly, they recognize, okay, well, we don't want to throw people in jail just because they might be protecting themselves. But Tom, they're not willing to take that one step further and say, you know what, people have a right to carry. They have a right to protect themselves, and you can't exercise that right in Maryland. They're still trying to straddle this line of, okay, well, we don't want to lock people up, but we don't want to recognize that it's a right either. We want to kind of criminalize it.
Well, I think there's something else going on here, and I think it's absolutely under the radar, Cam. And
okay.
It touches on to what you're talking about with Baltimore. I think, don't have anything to put this on, just a feeling. I think that there is a much greater awareness and appreciation for self-defense with firearms in sections of our country, the demographics that had been preached to that, no, you don't want to do that. And I'm really talking specifically about the African-American communities, a lot of people in urban areas who've been told, no, we have to have gun control. That's how we're going to protect you. And they watch the utter failure of that over decades, and they have kind of come to the realization that, no, if we're going to take care of ourselves, we have to do it, and we have to have the means to do it. I think there's a quiet little revolution going on there that we're not hearing about. But when you start doing these polls, that may be part of what's percolating there, too.
I suspect that you might be right, Tom. So are you heartened by this polling from the Wall Street Journal and the National Broadcasting Corporation, or are you a little concerned that the gap between the number of Americans who say, yeah, I'm really more concerned about the government taking away my Second Amendment rights is not bigger, compared to those who say, I'm worried that the government's not going to go far enough with gun control?
Oh, listen, I am heartened because I go back far enough to where only 25% of the population thought that we should have a right to have guns and that guns are used for self-defense. And so we have gone so far from that. I mean, there was a time in the late 50s, early 60s when the general population, when asked, honestly did say, yeah, it might be okay to ban handguns altogether. Think of where we are now versus that.
Well, yeah, it's night and day. I mean,
yeah, it is. And it, what it is, part of it, I want to tell you, part of it is what you and I did for a living, because the media covered up all that news for so long. And honestly, it was only 25 years ago or so when talk radio came around, and then maybe 20 years ago when the internet became, really viable, that we were able to do the around the filters, if you will, in the general media, and now people can hear information that they simply were blocked from before.
I think that I agree with what you're saying there, and I also wonder too, how much the NRA has had to do with this. I mean, again, you look at the kind of disrespect and the apathy that we're seeing towards the First Amendment. You could say that the ACLU is the NRA of the First Amendment, but I think the NRA is a much bigger and more effective organization. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if that doesn't have if that hasn't had an impact as well in terms of Americans' support for our right to keep and bear arms versus some of these other rights that we seem to not care as much about.
Oh, I would say absolutely. I think there's absolutely no doubt that the NRA has been the primary factor in the public's awareness of the need to fight and protect our gun rights. So, yeah, I mean, you know what it is? It's always getting that message out and having it there all the time. That's what it's really all about. Absolutely. Tom, listen, I appreciate you coming on the program, sir. It's always great getting to spend some time with you. Thank you so much, Cam. Absolutely. We'll do it again very soon. Tom Gresham, you can find him on Twitter at GunTalk, guntalk.com. Just turn on your radio over the weekend, and chances are you'll be able to find Tom Gresham doing his Gun Talk radio show as well.